Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Studium Generale Institut Teknologi Bandung. Today, on Wednesday, October 7th, 2020, we are very grateful to welcome all of you on Studium Generale by Principal Infrastructure Specialist of Asian Development Bank, Mr. Amr J. Qari, about strengthening disaster risk management toward a resilient Indonesia. To begin this event, please rise to sing the national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now we will have an opening speech from Director of Student Affairs of Institut Teknologi Bandung. Please welcome Dr. G. Prasetyo Aditama, MSN.
Terima kasih, Ibu MC. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Selamat pagi, hello everyone. I'm Prasetyo Aditama, the Director of Students Affairs of ITB. Good morning. Thank you for attending the Studium Generale. Mr. M, the Principal Infrastructure Specialist of ADB Indonesia Resident Mission. For all my colleagues and all of ITB students who are attending this class. To all students, you're really going to enjoy the time. And we spent together this morning. Mr. Amr J. Qari, Principal Infrastructure Specialist of Asia Development Bank Indonesia Resident Mission, will share with you some of the most important ideas regarding how to strengthen disaster risk management toward a resilient Indonesia. He will share his experience, infrastructure policies, and public-private partnerships, and some lessons learned from his practices, especially related to the disaster risk management in Indonesia, and maybe some from abroad. Mahasiswa ITB semuanya, secara umum Asia Development Bank atau Bank Pembangunan Asia ini merupakan sebuah organisasi pembangunan sosial gitu yang didirikan untuk tujuan mengurangi kemiskinan di wilayah Asia Pasifik melalui kegiatan pembangunan ekonomi yang inklusif, pembangunan yang berkelanjutan, dan integrasi regional Asia Pasifik. So this is carried out through investments in the form of loans, grants, and information sharing in infrastructure, healthcare services, financial and public administration systems, and also helping nations prepare for the impact of climate change or prepare for better manage their natural resource as well as other areas. Mr. Amr, Studium Generale is a serial of general lectures. It's dedicated for widening perspective of students from various students who came from various departments and faculties or schools. And as you know, in ITB, students learn about science, technologies, and arts. And we think it's obligatory for students to understand many issues other than their disciplines. The Studium General is conducting every week by inviting prominent figures or speakers from various fields such as economy and business, social and culture, also politics and other fields. The speakers came from government agencies or private sectors or other prominent individuals, national or international figures. Okay, to all students, enjoy the times and let's share ideas. And this time, I officially open the Studium General. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to continue the Studium Generale by Principal Infrastructure Specialist of Asian Development Bank, Mr. Amr J. Qari, about strengthening disaster risk management toward a resilient Indonesia. This session will be moderated by Mr. Sony Rustiadi, MBA, PhD. Please welcome Mr. Sony.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished speakers, Pak Prasetyo as our Director for Student Affairs in ITB. My name is Sony Rustiadi. I am the coordinator for the class 07 in the Studium General. And I'm very happy and humble to moderate this session together with our distinguished speakers, Pak Amr J. Qari, Principal Infrastructure Specialist for Asia Development Bank, Indonesia Resident Missions. Allow me to open our session today with reading his brief CVs. I'm also informing that Pak Amri is kind enough to invite two of his colleagues, three even, Ibu Catherine, Ibu Dini, and Pak Aji to join us this morning. Yeah, so we are really very humbled and very honored to welcome these distinguished speakers and prominent leaders for ADB in Indonesia Resident Mission. So a brief CV of Pak Amr. Mr. Amr J. Qari currently serves as Principal Infrastructure Specialist coordinating ADB's infrastructure-related operation. And related to our topic today, this morning, is about disaster risk management, intervention in Indonesia. So a lot of projects from ADB is under his coordination. Mr. Amr has assumed other roles in IDB, including as secretary to the procurement committee responsible for approving high-value contracts funded under the bank's sovereign operations. As we know that many countries as the sovereign nation of ADB, and Mr. Qari has also supported policy reform effort in fields of PPP, private-public partnership, public procurement, and construction management in ADB developing member countries. Before joining ADB, Mr. Amir worked as corporate lawyer at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett in New York. Mr. Amir holds an MBA in finance from Kellogg and Juris Doctor degree in law from Northwestern University School of Law. We are very happy to welcome you, Pak Amir. Good morning. And we are honored that you have spent some of your time to to chat with our students here. As I inform you, as we chit chat this morning, that we have listed almost 1,000 students taking this Studium General, and also as explained by Pak Pras, many prominent leaders from various sectors, from business, from NGOs. Last week we have Ibu Butet who are leading a school in the jungle, inspiration leaders like her. And also today we are very happy to welcome Pak Amir to probably said about information about what IDB is doing in Indonesia. But most importantly, Pak Amir, probably you can also enlighten us and also the student about our theme today, which is strengthening disaster risk management, or in short, DRM, towards a resilient Indonesia. We have about 30 minutes for your presentation, Pak, and we are going to continue with QA from the student about roughly 30 minutes also. And student, if you have any other question, please do write your question in the chat room, and me and the committee will choose which question we will ask to the speaker. In this case, Pak Amir, and also colleague from Asian Development Bank. Without further ado, Pak Amir, the time is yours, Pak.
Thank you, Sony. And let me just start off by saying that I'm very grateful to ITB for this honor to address both the faculty as well as the student body on this incredibly important topic of disaster risk management. Frankly, this is a particularly special occasion for me because I've had the privilege of working with many ITB alumni, as well as your faculty over the past few years. And in all of those interactions, I have come away incredibly impressed with the type of talent that this institution has been producing. And in a way, I'm frankly a little bit sad that we are not doing this in person, because I visited your campus several times and even lunched there and had a lovely time. So I'm a little bit sad about that. But let me perhaps share my screen and then just,
yes, sir.
Sorry. Maybe I can start off by just breaking up the talk into 4 different segments. First, I'd like to share with you a little bit about who we are, what ADB does, and then talk a little bit about our relationship with Indonesia, our overall approach to disaster risk management. Then we are going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Indonesia's disaster risk management journey, the successes, as well as the ongoing challenges. Then we'll dive into how ADB has been supporting disaster risk management in Indonesia. And then finally, I want to end with some words regarding how the students can manage themselves in these challenging times that we are living through because of COVID. Because certainly, COVID has changed the world in incredible ways. But I also think there's a silver lining in there. It should be giving students some pause in terms of internal reflection and how to make sure they're able to strengthen their own personal resilience for years to come. So I want to end my talk by sharing some ideas on that front as well, and then certainly we can get into this during the Q&A session as well. So let's get started. Pasoni, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it clearly, Pak Amir. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so ADB is a regional multilateral development bank. We were founded in 1966, headquartered in Philippines, more than 3,500 employees. We are owned by more than 60 member countries. And Indonesia is, in fact, one of our largest shareholders and actually a founding member of ADB. Now, what we do, so ADB as a bank, we are lending to our developing member countries. That's the big chunk of our business. And together with the lending, we also provide technical assistance support, policy advisory, capacity building support. And we also are able to make loans and do private and do investments in with private sector entities. Just to give you a little bit of a scale, idea of scale for our operations. So overall commitments for ADB last year exceeded $30 billion when you also include the co-financing that we were able to crowd in. Now, what differentiates or distinguishes ADB from other banks is frankly our mission or the vision that we work towards. And then you can see over here, it is to achieve a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. So it is a mission-driven organization. In terms of, I think it's also worth mentioning that not only is Indonesia one of our largest shareholders, it's also one of our largest borrowers. And on the screen over here, you can see that since our founding, we have made roughly about 40 billion worth of loans and provided technical assistance and grants to Indonesia. And you can also get a feel for some of the sectors that we are very active in, ranging from energy, finance, agriculture, public sector management. And if you want to get a feel for our annual lending to Indonesia, that's roughly about $2 billion a year. At least that was the case in recent years. Now with COVID, we have certainly increased our support, and in fact, this year, we are probably looking to double it. Now, it's also worth pointing out that ADB has a long-term strategy, which we call the Strategy 2030. And this strategy is essentially aligned with the SDGs. And what you will find is that disaster resilience is also a key priority under our own corporate long-term strategy. And you can easily see why if you look at the types of disaster losses that are being suffered by our developing member countries over the last 20 years. The numbers are absolutely staggering. So we are looking at more than 700,000 lives lost. You're looking at $688 billion in physical losses. Essentially, we're talking about around $100 million in losses per day. So just imagine the scale, and obviously the financial numbers mask the human suffering that lies behind these. Yeah. So on the next slide, you can see that we are just giving you a little bit of a feel for how ADB has created some financial instruments that are dedicated to addressing the needs as we go across the disaster risk management continuum. So if you look at the contingent disaster financing facility, which I'm going to talk about later because we have recently approved one for Indonesia, or emergency assistance loans, which we have also done for Indonesia that I'll get into later. And then you can see how these products are very nicely aligned to helping our developing member countries, whether they are working on disaster risk reduction or relief or early recovery or reconstruction. We also offer a lot of technical assistance to our developing member countries. And this type of work can be supporting policy reform work, or it can be supporting strengthening, for example, of insurance, of spatial planning. And one of the most exciting things that we are working on, and perhaps during the Q&A time, we can have one of my colleagues address this, is disaster insurance pools at a subnational government level. So that's a very exciting development that we would also like to share with you, perhaps if there's interest later on. Now here, I just want to be able to share with you the focus of our country partnership strategy. Now, when the National Medium-Term Development Plan was approved earlier this year, we also had to shift our country partnership strategy. So you can see over here how there are three strategic pillars or pathways for our strategy. The first one being improving well-being. So this talks about investments that we would be making in the healthcare system, social protection, etc. Then we have the second pathway of accelerating economic recovery. The focus there is the investments related to energy, transport quality, infrastructure, structural reforms. Then the last one, which is the most relevant for us for this talk, is in fact strengthening resilience. And disaster risk management and disaster risk finance are at the heart of this. So you can see that the disaster risk management in general is now pretty much a central element of our work with the government of Indonesia. Now let's talk a little bit about Indonesia's journey with respect to disaster risk management. Now, certainly, the transformative event that happened, which changed everything, was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And that was a kind of a very significant shift in terms of how Indonesia approached the topic of DRM. And after this, you saw the passage of Law 24 concerning disaster management, and which made Indonesia a lot more proactive about thinking through with, how to reduce disaster risk, how to be prepared for disasters. We saw the establishment of BNPB, which is the National Disaster Management Authority, and to coordinate the activities of across the different line ministries, as well as with the subnational governments. We saw the establishment of the local disaster management agencies, or the BPBDs, in all provinces and a majority of the cities and districts of Indonesia. And this is very much aligned with the Sendai framework, where the emphasis has always been on how we strengthen capacity at the local level. There have also been very huge investments in hydrometeorological and geophysical observation networks, early warning systems. And frankly, earlier this year, we saw the approval of the National Medium-Term Development Plan, which had very ambitious targets, both in terms of investments to be made in disaster risk reduction. So concrete target has been set up, roughly it's about 1.36% of the state budget. And there's also target with respect to reducing losses related to disasters. And in addition to this, and frankly, quite impressively, there are concrete commitments in there on how to protect women and other vulnerable groups during disasters. So this is all captured by the RPJMN. And the final thing that, that is worth mentioning, and which is a very significant achievement, is the introduction of the National Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Strategy in 2018. And essentially what this strategy is trying to do is to protect the state budget. Because think about what happens when there is a disaster. So there are two types of hits to the state budget, right? First, what you see is that the revenue is going to plummet, right? Because if you have businesses that are destroyed and you have folks who are losing their jobs, where's the tax revenue going to come from, right? So that's the first hit. The second hit is actually that the expenditures need to go up. And these are the routine expenditures as well that have to be realigned, meaning this is on schools or on hospitals, those types of expenditures, as well as on maintenance. So those and all of those things obviously are devastating for a society, right? So that's why you got to protect the state budget. And then there's also in this strategy laid out the goal of protecting households, strengthening the roles of the regional government and the private sector in financing disaster risk, and then finally with respect to strengthening the insurance system. So just to give you a little bit of feel for why we think this is a very, very good move from the government side, is that if you look at the diagram in the front, it shows you a little bit about how to finance different types, what kind of instruments to use for which kinds of disasters. So what you will see is for disasters that are very high frequency and disasters which are associated with low losses, what you will see is that it's better for the government to essentially use its own budget and to reallocate, etc. But then as the frequency of the disasters is kind of medium and the losses are also medium, you start seeing different types of instruments coming into play, and the contingent credit is one, which I'll talk about later. But then for the most extreme events, which are obviously happening infrequently, but with massive impact, you got to figure out a way to transfer the risk to third parties. Typically, you see in this case, insurance. And this is applicable both for households, for businesses, but also for the public sector, for the government itself. So what you see is that the government has already started putting in place these instruments. So for example, the contingent credit ADB has been supporting. The pooling fund is something on which the government has been working with the World Bank. And then the public asset insurance has already been implemented by the Ministry of Finance, and they're going to be rolling it out to the rest of the ministry. So this is a fantastic achievement from the government side. Now, we cannot underestimate the fact that there are still significant risks that Indonesia faces. And you can tell again by the figures over here, right? So if you look at from 1999 to 2018, you can see roughly 264 disasters, average annual losses of about 1.5 billion. Now remember, in the budget, you only have an allocation to deal with disasters of around maybe $200 to $300 million. So there's a huge kind of financing gap over there, and which is partly why that insurance, the financing and insurance strategy was so important. The costliest disasters you may already be familiar with. It's the Indian Ocean tsunami, the Yogyakarta, and obviously you know about the most recent disasters in Central Sulawesi, Lombok, etc. Now again, you also have to appreciate the fact that who bears the brunt of these disasters? It will always be the poor. It will always be the marginalized groups, right? So that is another important thing to keep in mind. Now, in terms of this problem and whether it's going up or going down, we have to be very keenly aware that both in terms of frequency and impact, the disasters are going up. And you can see the essential forces that are driving this. And we lay them out over here. So urbanization is one of the key drivers, right? So what you have is about 110 million people living around 60 cities, and They're exposed to common hazards related to tsunamis, flooding, communicable diseases, etc. And then obviously, if the spatial planning is weak, what you're going to see is a lot of development happening in flood-prone areas. And in fact, it's the most vulnerable segments of the population that are living in the most hazard-prone zones. The other issues that you'll be very familiar with, obviously, is land subsidence. Yeah? And here you see metro areas, whether it's Bandung, Jakarta, all of these sinking, and that magnifies the flood risk. Climate change, another huge issue with the intensity of so you see the rainfall intensity going up, sea levels rising, which will obviously exacerbate flood risk. And then certainly when you see the changes in rainfall and temperature, public health risks will also rise because you will see the emergence of certain types of diseases, or you'll see the expansion of certain types of diseases like malaria. The other aspect also is inappropriate agricultural practices. And here, deforestation has a huge role to play because it can lead to landslides. It can also lead to increased amount of sediments in the river waterways, which obviously then leads to flooding. Forest fires, another huge issue, not only from a global warming perspective, but also from the perspective of that when you are shrinking the habitat of these different types of these species, then what you're seeing is that more contact with people, and that leads to the spread of the zoonotic diseases or increases the risk that these diseases are going to spread more. So in terms of what are some of the ongoing gaps that we see in the disaster risk management ecosystem of Indonesia and the areas that we are trying to help the government on, certainly we see that spatial planning is one area. The building codes need to be revised in order to be informed by the hazard risk. Then early warning systems need to be able to monitor the full range of the disaster risk, but also to provide timely alerts. Emergency response planning is another incredibly important area because you need to think now what's going to happen once a disaster occurs. And by that, what I mean is you need to have an idea in terms of the command and control system, right? That who's going to be in charge? How are they going to be communicating with each other? What kind of equipment is needed, whether it's generators or whether it's certain types of phones that would still work. So all of those aspects have to be thought through now, because in the chaos of the disaster, you can't actually figure this out. Yeah. Then certainly there are capacity and coordination gaps between the different agencies that are involved in disaster risk management, and those coordination concerns are perhaps magnified when you start going to the subnational government level. On the engineering, construction, and operation side, we see that the engineering designs, again, have to focus on resilience. The construction quality has to be improved. There needs to be compliance with the law or the building codes that are on the books. And there has to be investment in maintenance, because again, if you are not maintaining the infrastructure, what's going to happen is it's going to be far more vulnerable when the disaster comes. Now, community readiness. And now this is an incredibly important topic. That are your communities ready to deal with disasters? And if you look at countries like Japan, which are perhaps one of the best prepared in the world, what you'll see is that disaster preparedness at the community level, that is kind of in the DNA, right? From the schools up, they are preparing the population that you got to understand the risks and you got to be ready to act, right? So there's got to be more emphasis on that. And then finally, financing gaps, that you need to be able to get the financial resources to the right place at the right time, right? So both the quantum, do you have the right amount, but also, are you able to get the resources fast enough? Because imagine again, what does it really mean? If the schools are closed, if the hospitals are closed, people cannot open their businesses, they can't travel to work. So every day counts after you have a disaster in terms of how quickly you're able to provide relief, but also to work on early recovery and reconstruction. And part of it is that if you don't act fast, some of those losses get magnified. So for example, if you have a business that is not getting customers in for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, that business is going to be lost forever, right? So those jobs associated with that, the livelihoods associated with that, they're going to be gone forever. So speed is of the essence. Now, let's switch gears and just talk a little bit about how ADB is trying to help the government in addressing some of these gaps that I've mentioned. Let me start off by a program that we have approved actually just last month. It's called the Disaster Resilience Improvement Program. So essentially, this program provides a standby facility to the government. And this facility can be pulled by the government in the event of a large disaster or a pandemic. So they can draw up to $500 million. Now, again, the emphasis is on speed, right? So when you have a big disaster, then the government has access to the financing and is able to draw on it within a period of days. Now, the other important feature of this instrument is that it gives us a platform to help the government also in some very ambitious policy reforms and medium-term policy reforms to enhance resilience. And I've, in the slide over here, given you a little bit of a taste for this. So for example, undertaking climate tagging of subnational government budgets. This is one of the things that the government is going to try to do, and we will be helping them. And why is it so important? Well, the reason is that you want to be able to track what kind of investments are going into climate adaptation, let's say, right? And in order to do that, you got to have a system. And one of the very important benefits of that system also is that you can later on go to the capital markets and raise financing through, let's say, green bonds and say that, okay, for all of these projects that we have identified that are green, we want to use the money that we have raised from, let's say, institutional investors. So you see, so that is also kind of very important mechanism to raise financing. We are also going to be helping the government with respect to disaster risk reduction tagging of national government expenditures, right? So anything that you are tagging, you are monitoring, and then you're able to see where the lags are and where more work is needed. Because if you don't monitor, you have no idea, you are kind of flying blind. We are also going to be working with the Ministry of Public Works and Housing on a whole set of very exciting and ambitious reforms. Some relate to the preparation of flood risk management plans. Others relate to strengthening disaster response management systems for the ministry. Let me move next to another very interesting loan that we have. And this loan is essentially to enhance flood protection in Banten and Maluku. And there we are providing support with respect to the provision of early warning systems, flood protection infrastructure, like dikes or spillways, etc. And the more interesting aspect for me also is how we involve the communities. And here, what we are showing you is that the communities will be engaged in thinking about what are the risks that are faced at the village level. And then the communities themselves would come up with action plans that what they can do with respect to getting prepared and their own emergency response plans. And in some cases, if they have the resources, they can in fact even participate in the design and delivery of infrastructure, whether you're talking about shelters or evacuation paths. And all of this will become gender sensitive, in part because these community-based organizations will have a significant participation from women, right? So what you will see is that when shelters, for example, are made, there's careful thought given to safety issues, like, for example, having good lighting, or also of privacy. Right, so these types of things, again, going down to the community level is something that I personally think is incredibly exciting work, and to frankly have this replicated across the country in due course, that would be absolutely fantastic. Now, in the aftermath of the Lombok and Central Sulawesi disasters, ADB approved several loans for the government. And here we describe those loans. And what you can see is that we had a $500 million loan that provided immediate support to, for the recovery plan that the government had. But then we also had a loan that focused on rehabilitation and reconstruction of assets in water supply, port, airport sectors. And we were essentially following what's called kind of build back better approach here. And what does that mean? Again, thinking about how to build resilience into the designs. And what are some of those ideas? So for example, having strong columns and weak beams, because if you do the reverse, what happens is that when there's a lot of shaking, then you essentially seeing the building collapse. Then bracing of non-structural elements, or thinking through how to actually leave large amount of green spaces when you see that a particular building, let's say, is very close to the Palu Bay, just to take one example. Having plenty of green space in there, but also making room for a tsunami shelter, making sure that you don't have classes happening at the bottom floor. So all of those things have to be thought through. In addition, we are also using new technology. So for example, using satellite imagery to be able to both map the risk. So what you see happening in Palu even today is that the land is moving, right? So what implications does that have on construction? All right, so we are able to do this by the use of satellite imagery, but you can also remotely start monitoring the pace of construction through the use of satellite imagery. The other aspect is to think about how new materials can be used. You may know that in Palu, liquefaction was another type of disaster. Not only did you have the earthquake and the tsunami, but it was accompanied by liquefaction, where essentially what happens is that the soil starts acting like water, right? And it pretty much absorbed full houses and buildings were just sucked in by the land. So in that case, what do you do? And one of the ideas that we have been thinking about is the introduction of new materials, for example, geogrids, and using that for when we do the rehabilitation of runways, because that will lower the liquefaction risk. Emergency response plans is another area that we want to help, especially when we are looking at the ports and the airports. And in fact, our approach is that what we are doing in Palu can then be replicated to other ports and airports that are in seismically active zones. I also want to touch on another aspect, which was operations and maintenance. And what you will see is in one of our other loans, and this is a loan which is dedicated to the rehabilitation of irrigation infrastructure. What we are doing is we are also scanning through LiDAR all of the irrigation assets. So we're looking at 2.5 million hectares of irrigation assets that will be scanned and that will be put in a web-based asset management inventory. And why is this critical? Because unless you know the condition of the asset, right, and unless you know what are your assets, you're not able to properly allocate O&M budgets, right? And as I mentioned before, if you're not making those investments now, it's going to lead to massive issues later on when the disaster happens. I also wanted to quickly just point out that in addition to loans, we also have made grants available to the government of Indonesia. The biggest one was following the Indian Ocean tsunami, so about 334 million. And then for the other significant disasters like Central Sulawesi or in Sumatra, we have also made grants. And we also have ongoing technical assistance work that we are doing in a range of areas. So for example, we are looking at mapping the climate vulnerability of Indonesia's critical infrastructure. We are thinking through with Bappenas how to strengthen the resilience of the urban poor, what needs to happen both in terms of community infrastructure or perhaps in terms of livelihood support, etc. So let me quickly switch gears now and talk something which is perhaps a little bit related to disaster risk management, but frankly, much more related to how students themselves can think of managing themselves in these times where we are facing kind of an ongoing disaster, in the face of COVID-19, that is. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts now from my side. You know, recognizing fully that these are very tough times, it means that we need to invest not only in our own physical resilience, meaning getting plenty of exercise, fresh air, etc., but also in terms of our mental resilience, which is equally important. Yeah? That how do you get your mind ready to deal with these types of issues where, you know, you are pretty much put in a room where you've got to be listening to lectures, you're not able to go out and see your friends. And so how do you train the brain to be able to deal with these stresses? Because human beings are social animals, right? That we thrive on each other, we want to communicate. And so you have to think about vehicles. Meditation is certainly one area that's worth thinking about. So it's kind of like, you know, going to the gym, but this is for your brain. So that certainly is one idea that I want to leave the student body with. The other idea I want to put out there is take this time to understand some very key things about yourselves. What are your strengths? What are your values? In terms of strengths, what I have seen in my life is that, you know, it is much easier to go from good to great versus going from average to good. Yeah. So that means that you got to know what are your core competitive advantages, and then you got to put yourself in situations where those advantages or strengths are put into action. But you got to know this about yourself. And many people, frankly, don't, because they haven't taken the time to reflect. And this is the best time to do it. You have all the time in the world. Then the other bit, frankly, which is equally important, is knowing your values. That what is sort of your moral compass? What are your principles? And it's important to think about careers that actually don't go against that value system. Because if you do that, if you do go into careers that may perhaps go against, either you're going to start losing respect for yourself or your work will not be as good as it could potentially be. The other thing, and this is the advice that I got a lot from my professors when I was in graduate school, is that, this is a beautiful opportunity when you are in the university surrounded by smart professors and surrounded by smart peers that take risks. What you have to do is take the difficult classes, put yourself out of your comfort zone, because guess what? Embarrassing yourself in front of a professor or a friend is much easier compared to embarrassing yourself in front of work colleagues. Yeah. So this is certainly another area where I would push the student body. And in fact, one of the things that I tell my son is that, take interesting classes like drama, for instance. People would laugh at it. Why do we take drama, right? And the reason is that communication is a huge part of our professional life and frankly, even personal life. And drama can actually help train some of those skills for you. And I believe this is particularly important for the engineering students because, I have come across so many brilliant engineering students, but in terms of communications, you saw that they have not had sufficient training. So, there is no magic to this. It's just a matter of practice, right? So certainly work on those areas. And then the last point that I would like to make over here is that disaster risk management is an incredibly exciting area, especially now. And it needs bright minds, and it especially needs a female bright minds because it is still dominated by men. And so I would very much encourage both men, but especially women, to also look at career paths in disaster risk management. I really apologize. I think I have gone on and perhaps beyond my allotted time. So let me end there and pretty much welcome any questions on anything related to the presentation, or in fact, if you have any other questions in general, happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Amir, for that lesson and experience shared about what ADB has done for Indonesia in terms of DRM or disaster risk management. If I can touch a few points that I think quite interesting and very important for us as a lesson learned is actually that ADB has been around for quite some time, from 1966, and it's a combined effort from not only one or two countries, but 68 countries, and Indonesia is also honored as one of the founding countries, founding members. Also Indonesia is one of the largest shareholders in ADB. So it's actually very important to Indonesia to play a role, not only to get benefit from ADB in terms of our own disaster risk management. And I am happy to hear from Pak Amir evaluation that we have quite a robust system for support in disaster risk management. But as we all know, disaster, we cannot predict disaster, Pak Amir, Although we know that Indonesia, as one of the countries under the ring of fire, we have a lot of volcanoes, we have a lot of movement in the earth, etc., and also with increasing temperature, global warming, Indonesia is the biggest archipelago for sure. Rising sea will mean that also a risk, potential risk for Indonesia in terms of flooding. In fact, Jakarta and also Sukabumi has just recently experienced flooding, Pak, just recently, although it's not as big as a national disaster, but still the potential risk of flooding is ever present in our daily life. in Bandung ourselves, we are sitting in the quite dangerous area because we are living in the mountainous area and we have some movement of the earth. We have an active volcano, I think, or a semi-active, if we shall say, yeah, the Tangkuban Perahu and surrounding mountains, because Bandung is surrounded by several mountains, yeah, 7 or 8 mountains around Bandung, and a majority is quite active. So not only we need to realize about this and perhaps learning from other countries who are quite advanced in terms of disaster risk management, and also about, I think, awareness in terms of Indonesian people. Yeah, sometimes this disaster, we as the citizen doesn't necessarily are aware about this really very harmful and very drastic risk disaster in our countries or our cities. Yeah. For in fact, I'm sure in Bandung, sometimes we forget that we are living in an active volcano, that sometimes there are movement in the land, some fracture in the earth that can cause an earthquake, yeah, or even, I hope it's not going to happen, but volcanic eruption, yeah, Pak Amir, yeah. So that's really very interesting for us to be aware of our surroundings, and that Indonesia, although we are a very very blessed country with all the natural resources, but with that also, because our position in the ring of fire puts us in ever present of disaster. Yeah. Um, I, as Pak Amir has explained, that IDB support not only about when disaster happened, but also the preparation, the policy, and how the government can create a structure so that when disaster happen, we as a country, as a nation, can be prepared. Yeah, as Pak Amir have mentioned about the PPD in all our provinces and all majority of our 500 cities and regions. That's also one of the important thing. Some parting student and body advice also very important from Pak Amir, yeah, for students. Yeah, because we are actually, I don't know whether this constitutes a disaster, Pak Amir, but also COVID-19 probably is not a natural disaster in the definition of a quick, very tragic disaster like volcano eruption or an earthquake, but it's still, I don't know whether it can be defined, ya Pak, ya, as a disaster also, a health disaster that happens in not in hours or minutes, but happens in months, or even some analysts predict it will happen for quite sometimes to 1 or 2 years in coming in 2021, ya Pak Amir. So we advice from Pak Amir in terms of our pandemic COVID situation is also to nurture not only our body but our mental health. Yeah, students, please do exercise, because exercise is also very important. As we know, with this COVID, a lot of you will be confined in your room, in your home, yeah. But being bodily active is also very important for your state of mind. Know your strength, know your value. And I particularly like the advice from Pak Amir that you need to go out of your comfort zone, ya Pak, ya, to take classes, to take professors, to take courses that might not probably within your own body of knowledge in terms of your faculty or school. For example, if you are a math student, probably you can take optional courses in urban management, for example, urban policy, or you can take my class in business and management school. Yeah, so you can actually broaden your knowledge, yeah, in other faculty also. So we have several. So if you have a question, you can students you can raise your hand so that the committee can help me with identifying your willingness to interact with Pak Amir. But we also have several questions from the student already in the chat room. Yeah, I would probably take one first from the question and answer, perhaps Pak Amir, and then probably if there is students wanting to interact with you directly, we have also two students already. Yeah, raise your hand. But let me take the written question. Yeah, first. Yeah, before we interact with the students. So the first question from Amelinda Stefani. So good morning, sir. My name is Amelinda from Craft Major. So this is from our art department, Pak Amir. I have a question. In this pandemic, a lot of jobs are being shut because of the global economic problems. A lot of people are jobless. Since a lot of companies were bankrupt. Yeah. So this is probably sits along my point of this pandemic as a disaster. Yeah, Pak Amir. Yeah. Disaster from different than from natural disaster, but this is also problem for human beings. So how can people and fresh graduate students in the future find job and fulfill their daily needs? Oh, okay. So this is a little bit more personal, probably, Pak Amir, but perhaps you can actually respond to this about the question.
No, and thanks. Sony. And this is certainly, I suspect, a question that is in the minds of many of your students, and I can very much sympathize with the type of stress that they are feeling right now, particularly because when students graduate, the first few years of their working life set the trajectory for the rest of the career. Yeah, so I'm very painfully aware of how important those first few years are. And this is certainly heartbreaking that, you know, if you're not able to get into those lines, there are no kind of perfect solutions over here. But what I would offer to the students is that given the fact that normal jobs are perhaps disappearing, right? But that doesn't mean that you cannot think about, let's say, more entrepreneurial things that you can do by yourself. You can do on the internet, right? That you are able to work, and you have skills that you're able to offer, and you offer those skills not only online, not only within for example, if you're a programmer, you are able to offer your skills all over the world. It doesn't have anything to do with Indonesia particularly, right? So certainly I would say that don't just think of this kind of a normal career path, because these are not normal times, right? So that certainly would be one, meaning I'm just putting myself in the shoes of the students of what I would be doing. That's one area.
Yeah.
The second area is that if you are just coming out, more important, I think, than money. Now, obviously, everyone is different, and financial pressures faced by different people are different. But if you can afford it, I would also say that try to go and work for places where you will learn the most, so that that time is not wasted. Yeah, so that you can say, you can have arrangements with different firms where you say that, okay, I'll come in, but I would like to even come in as an intern. And now I understand that you may not be able to pay me much, etc., but I would like to come in and learn. I personally would have put myself in those situations as well, because the first few years, you got to make sure that your fundamentals are right, whichever profession you're in. Yeah? So I started off as a lawyer. So the ability to go, for example, and work with a very experienced lawyer, learn the tricks of the trade, that would have been very important, because those are not the things that you learn in universities. Yeah? The way the world works, sometimes very, very different from what happens in universities. Yeah? So that's the other thing that certainly I would put out to folks to think about, that don't approach your job search in a normal way. because these are not normal times. So you got to think outside the box. And for every person, that answer is going to be a different one. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Pak Amir. So for the students, yeah, you need to find opportunities where you can learn the most and be creative and innovative in terms of approaching your career, ya, Pak Amir, ya, in this troubled time. So we have several students already raised their hands. If I may, Pak, to let one of the students. So we have Faisal Muzaki, yeah, already raising your hand. So Faisal, you can actually interact with Pak Amir. Faisal.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Sorry for the opportunity. Yeah, my name is Faisal from School of Business Management, sir, and I'm not really familiar with this topic, but it is quite interesting for me. So I'm wondering if there's a disaster happen on an area, who are really responsible to cover the damage? Is it the government only, or are there any kind of damage that become or company responsible?
Faisal, you are breaking up, but I think I can hear some of your question. Yeah. So your question is, when an event of disaster happens, who is responsible, yeah, in terms of repairing or fixing the damage, yeah? Is it the government or the individual that actually impacted by the disaster? Is that your question, yeah, Faisal, yeah?
Yeah, that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I will first offer the response that in Indonesia, certainly depending on the scale of the disaster, what you will see is that there will be a response at the local level. That's obviously the first bit of the response. But if the local authorities get overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, that is when you start pulling in, then you go to BNPB, the National Disaster Management Authorities, and then you involve ministries like Ministry of Public Works to come and help out. But I think the question that you have raised is a very interesting one, that how do we actually get the local governments ready to deal with the disasters? Because certainly there are certain assets, like, you know, if you're running your own business, the government may not have a role. But in the public assets, certainly the government will have a role in terms of figuring out how to bring back, whether it's the, you know, state-owned hospitals, schools. It's the government's responsibility to rehabilitate and then to start operating them again. And in that vein, let me, if you would permit me, let me invite my colleague, Charlie, who has been doing a lot of work in Philippines, and perhaps also ask her to share some of the great work that has been going on, and it's ADB supported work on how we can get the cities ready in order to face the disasters using insurance instruments. Charlie, are you there? Are you able to come in?
Hello, Miss Benson.
Hi, yes. Thanks very much. You can hear me, I guess.
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. So just for everybody's sake, I'm based in ADB headquarters in Manila. So I'm speaking to you from the Philippines. I'm Principal Disaster Risk Management Specialist. First, just to go back to the original question, it's important to remember that when a disaster happens, obviously government has responsibility for repairing public infrastructure. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Government also has a responsibility for humanitarian assistance to help ensure that people have adequate food, water, shelter, medical attention. Governments will step in as the insurer, what's called the insurer of last resort for the poor. But for poor and destitute families, governments will go beyond just the immediate relief phase, sorry, to help people sustain their daily lives while their livelihoods are being restored. Governments also then have an interest in economic recovery. And this is partly for their own benefit. If an economy does not recover, then the tax revenues do not recover. And so government will often be looking to stimulate economic recovery more generally. So not only with the small micro sized enterprises, but also potentially with bigger business as well. So for instance, through tax reductions and so on. And in the long term, that's in government interest. So for instance, in Japan, after, you may remember, a very, very big earthquake and tsunami in Japan in, I think it was 2011, the government actually spent more helping to restore the economy than it actually did on the physical reconstruction, because it recognized how important in the long term that was. So the government's role is much larger than just the damage to infrastructure. So that in turn means governments can face very significant bills. Humanitarian assistance costs alone come out at about 20% of the direct physical damage on average, looking at many, many disasters. That's a lot of extra financing to be found. So we have been working with governments to help them put in place adequate financing arrangements to be ready when disasters happen, with resources that can be relied upon. There are certain resources available to government, and governments can begin to plan their response efforts with those resources. In context of for instance, Indonesia and subnational government, there is, of course, I think it's Law 24 of 2007, which requires both national and subnational government to allocate some funds every year for potential disasters, because in Indonesia, you know, the country is extremely hazard prone. Floods, an earthquake, a tsunami, a volcanic eruption, a drought, forest fire could occur. So it's good practice to put some money aside. In practice, that is very limited, because the resources available, particularly to subnational government, are very, very limited. There is an opportunity cost. The government could have used that money for something else, to build a new hospital or health centre or school. So it doesn't want to put a lot of resources into that, but it can put some resources. So one needs to go over and above just that allocation, because the level that currently is economically viable means that when a disaster happens, in practice, the subnational government needs to look to national government for extra resources. And those resources in turn take time to flow. Amar mentioned the importance of speed. After a disaster, one wants to come in a very timely fashion to rebuild the infrastructure and so on. If not, the social, the economic implications of the damage to infrastructure just run on and on and on. And so the cumulative impact of a disaster is much greater. So one of the additional instruments that governments can look at is insurance. So this is where you pay an amount each year, as you would for your car insurance, your motorbike insurance, just in case something happens. Now, each subnational government, for instance, could of itself, be it a city, a province, or other unit of subnational government, could individually go out and purchase some disaster insurance. In practice, that of course requires knowledge. How do you do that? Where do you begin? It's also inevitably going to cost money. So there is a cheaper way of doing this, which is an idea we're looking at both in Indonesia and also in the Philippines, where subnational government comes together and creates its own insurance company. So that's known as a mutual insurance company or facility. And each member of that mutual insurance facility would each year pay some money, a premium, into the facility to create a central pot of resources that they could then draw on if a disaster happens. It would likely need some capital as well to be put in at the beginning to provide sufficient resources in case there are some major events in early years. But what this basically means is that it becomes cheaper if individually you buy insurance, you need to think about the major events that could happen and then buy enough insurance to cover those major events. So each city would be doing the same thing. If we come together, it's highly unlikely that all of the members, particularly if they're scattered across the country, would at the same time in the same year have a major event. So for instance, there might be a major tsunami in Sumatra in one decade or one century, in another, a major one affecting Sulawesi. But in the same year, the probability is very low. So it means that the total resources needed in this mutual insurance facility are lower. So each year, cities need to put in a lower amount than they would if they were doing it individually, because each year individually, you have to think about the maximum impact to that city rather than the cumulative impact from disasters right across all the members that you would receive in a pool. This is slightly complicated stuff, so I'm sorry if you've already lost me. We can do a different lecture on this. But anyway, so that's basically what we're working at. There's also a mutual insurance company isn't trying to make a profit. Yeah. So it reduces the cost. If you go to a commercial company, they want to make a markup. They want to create profit. And then there are economies of scale around the administrative costs and approaching the market, because you take out some reinsurance as well on this arrangement. There's huge knowledge benefits. The cities come together, collectively talk about the challenges, or the provinces, or whatever the unit of government is. So lots of additional benefits. This sort of idea has been very successfully implemented at a regional level, particularly in the Caribbean and Central America. And we're looking to bring it to subnational government. Exactly the same concepts that would work very well in countries such as Indonesia, where you have a large geographical spread, you have many different types of hazard. So you've got that diversification of disaster events across the country. I'll finish there. I hope that's made some sense. Happy to take further questions on that. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
So, sorry, there was also a question in there. I just quickly scanned on ADB's COVID-19 response, which I thought may be useful. Yeah, I did not include it in the presentation, but perhaps there are people who are interested in this topic. So with your permission.
Yes, Pak. There are several questions regarding COVID and disaster, and also a question in YouTube regarding, is there any ADB facility for this COVID situation? And perhaps several questions in the chat room, Pak. If you would like to respond, Pak, please.
Yeah, so maybe I try to just give an overview first of how ADB has supported the government in terms of its response. So what we have done is first, back in April, we provided a loan about 1.5 billion. So this is essentially a loan that will be supporting the immediate response from the government side, both with respect to the healthcare expenditures, but as well as social protection, etc. So this is something that we did very early on. And we are also able to bring in co-financiers. So we have had a co-financing coming in from AIIB, from JICA, from the KfW. So we have essentially more than doubled the initial amount that we had lent to the government. So in that sense, that was the start. We have also provided a $3 million grant to the Ministry of Health. And this grant was used for the procurement of PPE for critical equipment like the ventilators, as well as incinerators and refrigerators, etc. So that was another segment. Then I had mentioned to you this instrument called the Disaster Resilience Improvement Program, the $500 million contingent disaster financing. So in this one, what we have done is we have also set up triggers so that if there is, for example, another wave of COVID or a different pandemic, then the government has the ability to draw down on this loan. So we have also done that. Then in addition to that, in terms of technical assistance, we have been talking to different ministries. So with Ministry of Finance, we have been giving them some suggestions in terms of economic recovery. What's the best way to get that going? And also, we have been talking to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Protection, because remember, at this point, what is critical is that the people, and especially the most vulnerable populations, they have to be supported. So one of our ongoing technical assistance projects looks at how to expand the net and make sure the right people are being included in that, in far-flung areas, for example, in Papua, that are we getting the right people in our social safety net. So we have also been working on that front. So there are many different facets. One of the perhaps the more, I guess, urgent things that we are helping the COVID-19 task force with is to think through how to develop a vaccination rollout plan, right? That these are very complicated questions. That even if you are able to secure a vaccine that is safe and that is effective, but who should this vaccine be given to and how will it be given to them, right? Because imagine our vaccination program is only dealing, in all countries, deals with kids, not dealing with adults, right? So how do you get, let's say, 170 million people vaccinated? Where do they go, which facilities to make sure also that the vaccine that is being given is given properly, right? And also it is disposed of safely, and that it maintains its effectiveness by going through the cold chain, right? So if you lose the cold chain, the vaccine is useless. The other issue to think through is vaccine hesitancy, meaning in Indonesia, there has been a concern that people don't want to take the vaccines. And measles, for example, saw that when they were doing the measles campaign, that there was a relatively low turnout of people. So if people are losing faith in vaccines and you give them a COVID-19 vaccine that is not effective, then the fear always is that it might actually have the public lose confidence even in their routine immunizations, right? So these are incredibly difficult questions that our government counterparts have to weigh, have to think through, and we are trying our best to help them on these fronts. Over to you, Pason.
Thank you, Pak Amir. So in response to COVID, not only about loan and also creation of fund, but also and also grants, but also planning what's next, Pak Amir. In Pak Amir example and explanation is how we roll out the vaccination plan. So while the medical professional is preparing the best vaccine, the most safe and the most effective, here Pak Amir and also colleague from ADB is helping nation to plan the rollout or the distribution, the logistics of vaccinating adult, Pak Amir, because we are talking about adults here, not only about babies. And although in Indonesia we have puskesmas, but they are geared towards babies and under 3 or 5 years old rather than adults, Pak. Okay, I hope that explains our several questions asking about assistance in COVID disaster. Because we also have addressed the YouTube question, I would also invite the students who has raised their hand. Aurelio Deandra, you can unmute Aurel and interact directly with Pak Amir, and we have Charlotte all the way from the headquarters in the Philippines. Thank you very much spending your time with us, Ms. Charlotte. Aurel, your question?
Okay. Thank you, Pak Sony. Mr. Amir, I want to ask actually two questions, but regarding the time, perhaps it's only one question, right? Okay, my question is suppose there is an, oh yeah. First of all, my name is Aurelio Deandra. I am from astronomy study program. So I want to ask if there's an hypothetical event of meteor impact, like perhaps one in Tunguska event or in Russia in 2013. I forgot what the name of the event is. How would the ADB react to such event? I mean, is it just like another natural disaster, like on earthly disaster, or perhaps some more reaction is given?
So what kind of event, Aurel?
Let's just say a hypothetical meteor impact.
Meteor. Oh,
Yeah.
I see. From outer space. Yeah, okay. Okay, because it's related to Aurel study program, Pak Amir. So what about, yeah, this is natural lah, ya, because it's from outer space, but what about meteoric disaster? Is that also include or defined as natural disaster, Pak Amir?
Let me invite Charlie, because she's one of the architects of our emergency, or
yes,
at least
yes.
she's been thinking about these issues a lot. Charlie, over to you.
Very unique question,
yeah.
Mr. Lord. Yes, please.
Sure, it's not a question I get every day, but it is actually people in the disaster risk management field do talk about such events as well, and the implications of them, not least that, of course, depending on the landing spot, that could generate a tsunami, a very major tsunami, affecting many, many countries. If one of ADB's developing member countries was either directly affected or indirectly through, for instance, a tsunami, or through the economic repercussions of that event, you know, say that meteorite hit a major industrial area in Japan, and that had supply chain issues that impacted through the region, then it's entirely possible that the ADB would respond. Our basic emergency assistance loan instrument would certainly still operate. So that is fast-tracked loans and grants after a disaster. If it was of a particular economic bent, then there's also something called a counter-cyclical support facility that potentially could apply. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult in the abstract to work through quite what this would entail, but it's certainly something that if there was countries in a dire situation because of that.
And it's the same set of instruments, right? So all the same lending instruments, because somehow the impact is going to flow through and impact people, right? So if it's an economic impact, we have a whole bunch of lending instruments to deal with that. We have the same kind of grants that can be offered for to support immediate response. So I think that would be kind of, I think I'd completely agree with Charlie over here. But interesting question.
So, thank you, Aurel, for
taking us into the space age. I love it.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Amr, and thank you, Ms. Charlotte.
Thank you, Aurel. So before going into question in chat room, I would like to invite another interaction from the student, if I may, ya, Pak, ya, because I think question from live interaction is more interesting. So we have Wirawan Lingga. You can unmute Wirawan and directly interact with Pak Amir and Ms. Charlotte here from Asian Development Bank. Wirawan, are you with us?
Yeah, but sorry, first I can't activate my webcam. Is it okay?
Yes, at least we can hear your voice. Yes.
Hey, thank you for the chance, Pak Sony. My question is something revolving around rehabilitation and reconstruction. And in the past, roughly a decade ago, the Asian tsunami, Indonesia was in fact one of the hardest hit of the tsunami affected countries, right? And ADB's response at time relates to rehabilitation reconstruction, and lastly, followed by preventive measures such as warning systems and the likes. But in cases like these, what should be the role of government agencies, for instance, in house construction? And should the government treat both the rich and poor, homeowners and tenants the same? Who should be served first in cases like these? Thank you.
Okay, can you also inform us from what study program you are, Wirawan?
Oh yeah, sorry. I am Wira from Mechanical Engineering.
Mechanical Engineering. Okay. Thank you, Pak Amir or Ms. Charlotte, if you may respond.
Certainly, I think so. That's a very important question. And as you know, when you have these types of massive events, housing infrastructure is certainly the most vulnerable, and as has been recognized that before, that it hurts the vulnerable populations the most. And what you will find is that the governments always react to this, and they always provide support. And it's certainly in Central Sulawesi that we see this happening, and then assessments have to be made in terms of what is the extent of the damage, and then there also has to be some thinking around what are the means that are available to those people to fix their homes. And then certainly the government is able to provide support to finance the reconstruction. But I would imagine that there must be a filter where the vulnerable populations have to be prioritized, certainly. Charlie, would you add to that?
Sure, thanks. I agree. This is a very important question. At the end of the day, different governments respond differently. They take different approaches regarding what they feel to be their responsibility. Disasters, as we've established, particularly when we have an event like the Indonesian tsunami, are incredibly costly, not only to governments, but also the wider international community. So there is certainly a case for targeted support. It's also important to bear in mind that the likely support that would be received would be a standard amount, which would not necessarily be particularly meaningful anyway for middle-class homeowners who are looking to restore much grander properties. What governments could, though, potentially do is upfront is encourage middle-income homeowners to take out insurance. Governments don't need to subsidize this. This can be done through financial literacy campaigns and so on. It could be where there are mortgage markets, require those who hold mortgages to have disaster insurance in place to help in a very explicit way to shift that responsibility away from government. Because this is sometimes where it gets a bit murky. If government hasn't defined ahead of time where its responsibilities lie and where they stop, then everyone can automatically look to government for support. If government ahead of time has said, this, in the event of a disaster, is the types of compensation we will offer, and that housing support is already indicated up front as only being available to people with incomes below a certain threshold, then everybody knows where they are. Those above that threshold know it is their responsibility to plan ahead and to perhaps take out insurance and other measures to strengthen their homes as well, rather than go, oh, it doesn't really matter, we know it might collapse, but there might be a bit of damage, but it's fine, the government will help us out. Government wants to avoid those attitudes to the extent possible to look for joint sharing responsibility. Thanks.
Okay, so that's actually important question, because in the event of disaster, everybody suffering, Pak Amir and Charlotte, and in that sense, the question becomes important, those who have more economic resources and those who has less, shall we say, the vulnerables, So for sure that would be very, as Charlotte, Pak Amir explained, is very dependable on that situation happening, Because of time, I'm probably going to pick one last question before, for sure, also perhaps closing statement from Pak Amir and Charlotte. I'm going to take question from Timothy. He actually asked about, because ADB is constantly working with regional or national government, Pak Amir Indonesia, and perhaps in other countries also, and Charlotte in home office in the Philippines, but also working with various national government. What is the most common problem that you think facing working with this local and national government, Pak Amir and Charlotte? Perhaps one or two problem that perhaps you think is the most important to address in collaborating, communicating, and perhaps coordinating with this national and local government in Indonesia, and also in perhaps in various countries, if you can, and also perhaps some closing statement, Pak Amir and Ms. Charlotte.
So Pat, just to clarify, so the question was, what are the most significant systemic problems with respect to disaster risk management being faced?
Yes, Pak. Working with various governments, agency, and local and national governments, Pak. One or two problems that you have encountered, Pak.
Yeah, I think for me, at least what I have seen in Indonesia, the challenge has been number one in terms of capacity and simply because, you know, as I mentioned, that we started only after the Indian Ocean tsunami. Do you see the culture kind of changing, right? And then this topic becomes more and more important, and you can see how it is spreading through the ministries and how they are improving over time, right? So the capacity is going to build over time, and we have to invest in that. And that's part of the job of the electorate, to ask their elected leaders, how well are we doing? Because you see, if the demand is not coming from because remember, so the issue is that these types of long-term investments that have to be made, right, for disaster risk reduction, you don't see an immediate benefit. So the natural political incentive is not aligned to do this work. So that's where the electorate has to come up and to be able to say that, look, what are we doing? So you have to push the agenda, and that's where the role of civil society, I think, is also very important, because that gets the government to keep the focus on and to keep on improving. And one of the other things that I think is also that this career path has to be seen as something that is important within government, because one of the issues that especially I have seen at the BPBDs is there's a lot of role, what I would say is kind of, you know, turnover in officials. So people come, they spend maybe 1 year, 2 years, and then leave for a different agency.
Yeah.
See, so any institutional knowledge that is built in then moves out. And especially when the budgets are very strained at the local government level, and then you constantly bring in new people, you got to train them up. So for me, that kind of investment in human resources, frankly, is very, very important. In terms of the closing statement, I think the key thought for me would simply be to have your student bodies already asking a lot of thoughtful questions, whether it is about COVID-19, whether it's about their careers, about disaster risk management. And that's the right way. And the most important thing that I can leave the student body with is that don't let this time go to waste. Yeah, that COVID-19, yes, it's terrifying, it's challenging, but look for how to make the best of this situation. And that can be to build yourself up. It can be to volunteer in different ways for different, initiatives that are ongoing, where you can still maintain social distance, etc. So just don't let this opportunity go. Spend the time to figure out how to don't get demoralized, because being demotivated, demoralized is not going to help anyone, right? Certainly not going to help you. So just use your mental energy, in the most productive fashion, even though we know that this is a very stressful time. So I'll stop there. Charlie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I agree with everything Amar has said. There's one further problem I'd like to highlight, and that is time. We often have relatively little face-to-face time with, particularly with local government. You go in for a meeting and that's it. And if the time is made available, it actually doesn't take very much to really build capacity and to get a strong understanding in place of the basic concepts that we're dealing with in disaster risk. You know, what is a 1 in 10 year flood? Are we talking about a flood that happened last year and won't happen for the next 9 years? No, we're talking about something with a 10% chance of happening each year. Some very simple concepts that, if time is taken to get those across, sort of takes you up very quickly to the next level. We, in working on this mutual insurance facility idea that I presented to you in the Philippines, we spent a lot of time talking to 10 individual city governments. And at the end of it, they really understood this. We also looked at this issue that Amar raised about turnover of government staff. And we took advantage of the fact that disaster risk management is interdisciplinary. We don't need to just talk to one person in one division or even that whole division. We need to talk to multiple divisions across subnational government. And that in turn means that in likelihood, you're going to be talking to some people who will be there for the long haul. And so that's really important, is to just take advantage of that interdisciplinary nature of the topic and build, if you're taking all the time to do a workshop anyway, bring in people from a wider range of divisions within that local government. Closing remarks. We've had questions, I think, if I've heard correctly, from people working on crafts, on business, on astronomy, on, I think, engineering, the last one. You all have potential roles in disaster risk management. It is multidisciplinary. I encourage all of you to really, really strongly think about how you might apply your skills in this area, and particularly women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Charlotte and Pak Amir. So that actually concludes our Studium General this morning. Yeah, if I may extract several lessons learned both from Pak Amir and Ms. Charlotte today, is that this disaster management is about, the problem is actually in Indonesia or other countries, is about capacity development. And so talking about disaster risk management, it's about interdisciplinary approach, talking with diverse people with diverse background, because we have to have that local aspect in terms of that management of disaster, before it happened, when it happened, and after it happens. And in terms of your own perhaps lesson learned to be carried away from our Studium General this morning is about self-development. Yeah, so use your time as students in ITB, in whatever major you are taking, in whatever faculty or school you are taking. Use this time to the best of your own self-development. Be brave to take to leave your comfort zone and take whatever it is perhaps interesting, may not be related to you at this moment, but you can also but you can always connect the dot after you have started your career outside your campus and university. As a moderator, I would like to give the highest appreciation for Pak Amir for being our speaker today, and also for Ms. Charlotte for joining us and giving the perspective from the headquarters of ADB in the Philippines. It is very happy to host you this morning, both of you, Pak Amir and also Ms. Charlotte, and also our colleague from ADB, we have Ibu Dini and Pak Aji also joining us this morning. I hope it has been a very refreshing but also very intellectually engaging for you students, yeah, this morning sessions. This is about risk disaster management, and although we are living in yeah, shall we say, very naturally resource gifted countries in the world, but we also need to be aware that we are geographically situated in quite disastrous area, yeah, in the world, with the ring of fire, with the potential risk of natural disaster. And also we are at the moment facing a very big disaster, which is the pandemic COVID-19 disaster. So you need to actually be aware of what's happening in the environment, in our life, but also be prepared and take this challenge. Yeah, we need to take this as a challenge to develop ourselves, to better ourselves, and to better prepare yourself after graduation. I would like to apologize for any problems, for any error, both to our speakers and also to our students. And with that, I would like to close the session. Billahi taufiq wadayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Over to the Master of Ceremony, or this today we have a lady, so Mistress or Miss or Mrs. Ceremony, ya. Mbak Vera, time is yours. Thank you very much.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Studium Generale has come to an end. Thank you for your attention. Good afternoon and have a good day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.